a continuation of our online speaker series that we started up early this year, trying to do more events online for obvious reasons, and it's been very successful. And we've had some great guests, and Cleo is the latest in that great lineup. So I'll just tell you a few little bits and pieces before we get going, and I introduce Cleo properly. So I'll be doing a short intro of the event, and then Cleo will take center stage and do a talk for us for about 20-25 minutes. We'll have some Q&A after that, and we will be finishing just before 8 to allow Cleo to get on and get her son to drumming lessons, which is more important than this event. So we'll make sure we do that for her. If you have a question during the event, please pop it in the chat. I'll be monitoring that and I'll collate them. And when we start the question and answer portion, I'll group the questions together and I'll invite you to come off mute and ask Cleo your question directly. And then we'll go from there and get more questions. So we will get going now. So I'm very excited because we're going to be discussing the Black Lives Matter movement in several different contexts. And although we saw a lot of action over the summer, and we certainly heard lots of talk from all the political parties and other parts of society, kind of already feels like the conversation is maybe slipping away or is being turned down a little bit. And that's why the work of activists and politicians like Cleo is so important. And I think there's a real opportunity for us in the Green Party to lead on social and racial justice, and really weave that into our manifesto alongside our other policies and our other kind of obvious environmental policies. And I'm definitely looking forward tonight to being challenged, to continuing to learn about racial justice and the actions that we all need to take to address it. So Cleo, she's been very active in this space between green policy and social justice for a number of years. She's been a councillor in Bristol since 2016, and she was also Lord Mayor of that city, which is pretty cool. And she recently came a very close second in the deputy leader election for the National Party, and you may well have seen her campaign, very active campaign, very strong campaign in that election. She was prominent in campaigning during the recent Windrush scandal, or the exposing of that, and more recently has been leading on the Decolonizing Bristol movement and the reparations motion that recently passed at our party conference. And I think we'll be hearing about that throughout her talk. You can follow Cleo on Twitter at CleoDanceBatten, and she has a blog as well, which I'll be posting in the chat room a bit later. So after all that, it's a real pleasure to hand over to Cleo. So over to you, Cleo. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. It's great to be with you for this hour or so. And I hope you're all having a great Black History Month. Of course, Black history should be something that we look at, celebrate, enjoy, learn from all year round, because it's all of our history. I hope you would agree with that. So I do hope this is going to be a conversation and that we have enough time at the end to make it a conversation. So I do want it to be interactive. I do have some notes and some bits and pieces, some points I would love to share with you that I hope would be thought-provoking, and that you would have either questions or statements, thoughts, emotions even, that you would like to respond with. But first of all, I thought I would just have a few reflections on Black Lives Matter and the Green Party, which is the subject of tonight. And reflecting on this, I thought, where should I start? And I thought it would be a nice positive way to start, to say that I certainly would see that it's been the Green Party that has been, in its leadership, very visible and actively supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. And I say that from both a national and a local perspective. Me, myself, as a Green Party councillor, I have spoken at least 2 rallies we've had in Bristol. We have the All Black Lives Matter movement here, which were the group of young people really who did the first protest back in June. That of course led to the infamous occasion of the toppling of the statue of infamous enslaver Edward Colston, which I'm sure you all heard about because it made international news and had an international influence. So that's important to note. And it is important to note that I do consider much of the Black Lives Matter movement to be quite a youth-led movement, a little bit like the youth climate strikes as well. I think those two things have kind of sprung up at a similar time. What else have the Green Party been doing? Well, I am a member of the Greens of Colour, and I'm currently the Southwest officer. And one of the things that occurred a couple of months back was the Greens of Colour 5 demands for racial justice that I hope many of you may have seen, but you may not have seen. And I'll just briefly go over these. And there was quite a bit of press from headquarters around this, which was great. And these are 5 demands for racial justice. And they are, the first one, it was spread over 5 days. The first one was to scrap the NHS surcharge. The second was an inquiry into Black and minority ethnic, I don't like to use that term if I'm honest, BAME, but that was what was listed here, into the COVID-19 deaths, because I'm sure many of you may have heard that it seemed to have affected disproportionately people of colour. Day 3 was to decolonise our education curriculum. Again, something that's been pretty topical nationally generally since the Black Lives Matter movement this time round. It's interesting to note that there were a few government petitions to this end about diversifying the curriculum and being able to give our young people a holistic view of history and a more rounded view, and a view that has multiple narratives and can also confront racism, anti-Semitism, prejudice, and all of those things from an early age. I would note that actually the government, in response to some of these petitions, kind of deflected it and said, really, you know, some teachers are at liberty to teach what they want. Also note, though, that more recently, the government has come out with things saying that that teachers should not be promoting or presenting anything that comes across as anti-capitalism. Take what you will from that. Day 4 was take racist abuse out of politics, and myself and 2 other councillors of colour signed a letter to that end to government, because we can appreciate how challenging it is for women, and particularly women of colour, in the political landscape. But I'm happy, and I'm sure you'll be very happy to know that that's never put me off. Day 5 was to end indefinite detention of migrants. Again, quite a long-standing campaign from the Green Party generally, which I'm proud to support. But should we also reflect on the case of Rashid Nix, who has been a long-standing Green Party member, and in fact has been someone who stood in leadership positions, i.e. councillor roles, within Brixton and Lambeth in London. Very, very active in his local community. He is of Caribbean heritage, African Caribbean heritage, and is very, very well known. And I would say has done quite a lot within that community to promote the policies of the Green Party and try to extend our reach. More recently, well, in the last couple of years, he was also the equality spokesperson on GPEX. However, unfortunately and sadly, he is currently trying to sue the Green Party for racial discrimination. I'll leave that there. It's something, if you wish to, you could look into, but it's perhaps something to reflect on. We could also reflect, and you heard in the opening that I did stand to be the next deputy leader. And I think it was a good campaign, and I came a good second. And beyond myself, should we also reflect that we have, as a party, now returned a purely white leadership? Reflect on that. I'm not saying it's right or it's wrong, it's just an observation. Jumping back into Black Lives Matter. In fact, the first wave of Black Lives Matter came officially in 2016. I don't know how many of you were aware of that, but that was when the movement actually started. And again, although it started in America, it did spread over to the UK. And at that time, I had just been elected actually as a local councillor in Bristol. And in June 20, that was the end of May. And in June 2016, I gave one of my first public speeches as an elected councillor outside City Hall in Bristol on a Black Lives Matter protest. So I thought I would just share with you what I had to say. And this is also on my blog. If you scroll through, you can also pick up some of the points if you don't catch it all. So here's what I said in 2016, and the title was Black Lives Have Always Mattered. I am outraged at what is happening to our brothers and sisters in the US. I am equally outraged by what's going on in our nation worldwide and of the lack of action that we are taking collectively. Black lives have always mattered. They mattered when they invented civilization. They mattered when they created the first university in Mali. They mattered in maths and they mattered in ancient science. They still mattered when they were taken against their will and were enslaved on plantations, which built much of America and Europe's wealth. Well, guess what? It's 2016 and 2020. And not only do Black lives still matter, but Black lives are still being lynched and Black lives are still working on plantations, albeit in a different guise. The Black pound and the Black dollar are amongst the most strongest spending powers in the world. So I ask the question, why are so many of us still poor? At that time, I was the deputy leader of the Green Group in Bristol, and I wasn't using it as a political platform, but I did want to raise some points that health matters, quality of life matters, air quality matters, non-GM food matters, climate change matters, and climate change might matter to some of us even more when countries that we love, like Jamaica, will not only endure beaches plagued with plastic and hurricanes, but they will also cease to create their famous Blue Mountain coffee because of climate change, which will cripple farmers even more. The farmers, many of whom descend from enslaved Africans who were left with nothing when emancipation came. Plantation owners were compensated, but former enslaved were left to die, and in many ways are still being left to die today. We cannot separate this history from our current truth. We have been fighting for freedom for over 400 years, and we simply cannot stop now. Let's focus on what actually truly matters. All I know is that I matter, my family matters, and all of you matter. Black children who die in mines in Congo to supply us with mobile phones matter. The disproportionate number of us in mental institutions and prison matters. The number of us with diabetes and preventable diseases matters. The way we talk to each other matters. Love matters. Caring matters. Respect matters. And humanity mattered. The obvious and subtle genocides that are happening need to stop. We are Africans. Let's stop running away from who we are. We are the global majority. We all matter, and we have been at the forefront of invention and creativity, having created many things in this world, but I note that guns were not one of them. So that's what I had to say in 2016. Of course, my views haven't changed, and it would be interesting to have any thoughts on that from yourselves, and whether people actually accept, realize, or acknowledge the contributions that people of African heritage have made in the world. I hope it's something that people can acknowledge. I hope people know about Moorish history, for example, and perhaps reflect on the fact that Europe was controlled by Black people, African people, for 800 years. So, moving forward a bit, what have I been up to? Well, over the past few years, I have been involved in the reparations movement. And again, as we heard, we have passed a reparations motion at our conference. So we are history makers as a party and recognizing, along with key activists and campaigners, that it's highly unlikely that we will meet the challenge of climate change unless we try to repair this historical damage and the damage and harm that still continues to happen, both to people and to planet. My involvement in the reparations movement has increased from attending an annual march. There is an annual march that happens the 1st of August every year. It goes from Windrush Square in Brixton to the Houses of Parliament. And it is an event where it's led by people of African heritage, but there are also different blocks, including an allies bloc. And the allies are always welcome to join us in our calls. The overriding call is that there is a charge to the British state of genocide and ecocide, and there is a petition to that end. So I've gone from attending that march to speaking at the rally and to organising the artists and musicians bloc. And I was even part of the delegation last year to hand the petition in to Downing Street. I didn't get to meet Boris, but I did play a caricature of Boris in a recent theatre production. I was the embodiment of colonialism, as an aside. I'm sure I'll find a link to it and share it with you if you're interested. This year there wasn't a march, and it wasn't just due to COVID, it was a deliberate intention to change the strategy. And it was a great collaboration, in fact, between campaigners and actually organisations like Extinction Rebellion. The intention was to have a reparations rebellion lockdown in Brixton. And I think that's quite interesting. And I can also reflect living in St. Paul's, Bristol, where I've lived for many years and always been connected to, which happens to be perhaps traditionally the area in Bristol where people of African heritage tend to live or have tended to live. Of course, many things have changed. When we think of gentrification, could that be some kind of ecocide? It's certainly displacing people. When we think of indigenous, could we say that people of African heritage are somehow now indigenous to places like Brixton? Yet what's happening in places like Brixton and other places around the UK? Well, we're seeing things like gentrification. I have also presented a reparations motion to Bristol City Council. This has some national aims, such as calling for an all-party parliamentary commission of inquiry into truth and reparatory justice. So when we think of reparations in terms of trying to stop the harm and remedy and heal from the harms of the past, it's not about any one campaigner or councillor or politician or person saying what reparations should look like. In fact, the first step for many of the key campaigners is to get this commission of inquiry, a governmental commission in collaboration with activists who can sit, spend time, discuss, educate, understand, and come up with a concrete plan about reparations. Campaigners also do not see reparations simply as compensation. It is something that goes beyond money, but money, or how should we say, investment, would be part of it. 2 reparations motions have actually passed in Lambeth and Islington. That happened in July, and that was led and driven by Green Party councillors, again in collaboration with campaigners. So we can get a sense of confidence in our community that the Green Party perhaps is a political home for people of African heritage who recognise that they are still subject to intense discrimination in many, many forms. One of the words that campaigners use is a Swahili term called maangamizi, and that tries to sum up the element of the historic harm, i.e. colonialism and enslavement, but also the present harm that continues. And in any journey for reparations, the first step would be to stop the harm. Another personal reflection, where did the idea of reparations start for me? Well, it actually started for me around the age of 9 years old. My father, he passed away when I was 10, but I describe him as a very proud African man who was born in Jamaica. And I make that point because growing up, and even to this day, there is in certain elements of our community a split. It's been a struggle at times for people to accept and embrace their African heritage. But I'm very, very pleased that my father was proud to be of African heritage. My father had a restaurant in Bristol called Jamaican Good Food, which again was in the St. Paul's area of Bristol, which is one of our diverse areas. I would go over to the restaurant every Saturday, and he would usually order me and my sister a taxi home. But on this day, it was just me that went over, and he actually walked me home, which was quite unusual because he was a workaholic. And we stopped at a black bookshop. We did have one or two back in the 80s, and now we don't have any, which is quite sad. But I know that there is a popular, it's becoming popular again. And of course, I'm sure many books have flown in sales over the last couple of months. But anyway, we stopped at this bookshop, and he went in and he collected a large paper bag, a large brown paper bag. And then we set on our way walking home. And then we stopped on our way when we were approaching our house, and my dad handed me this large brown paper bag, and it was quite heavy. And he said to me, "When you're old enough to understand, read this." And here is the book that he bought me. This is actually a replica, and I'm sorry that it's kind of not mirrored, so you maybe can't read it very well, but it's called Black Americana. And it charts one of the first, in the first page, it's got just names and names and names of all the people who've contributed to society. And the first chapter is From Slavery to Freedom. Chapter 2, The Journey Forward, and chapter 3, Black America Emerges. And then the first page, hope you can kind of see that, is the map of Africa. And it is an image that I've seen a few times in my life, an image of Europeans leading my ancestors out of Africa. Ironically enough, that was actually an image that appeared via a tweet from the Treasury in 2015, with a kind of few words along the line saying, "Congratulations, Britain and British people, you taxpayers, well done. Give yourself a pat on the back, because in 1833, when we ended slavery, well, you were still paying for that in 2015. And it was quite baffling. And it was actually David Olusoga who raised this on Twitter. And the reality is that we were all, as taxpayers, paying back the debt paid by the British government to enslavers on abolition and emancipation. Abolition and emancipation came in some ways because the British state agreed to pay off people who would have made a loss on abolition, on freedom of human life. So there was fortunes that were paid out, millions by today's money, in today's money. And let's reflect that actually nothing was given to the people who were enslaved. And to much of an extent, a lot of that poverty still very much exists, because one thing that we do not have generally in our community, I speak as an African Caribbean British person, is that we have not yet built up intergenerational wealth. And it feels like for every generation, we're constantly starting from scratch because we haven't been in a financial position, and because so many odds are often stacked against us. But I'm sure you'll agree with me that still we rise. And often we can rise as well from the support of others. And I have felt supported by the Green Party in all of the activism I do. Right, what do I also want to share with you in the few minutes I've got? As I said, there is a petition, We Charge Ecocide and Genocide, and that was influenced by an African American movement in 1951, which said, we charge genocide, the crime of government against the Negro people. And that was a paper accusing the United States government of genocide based on the UN Genocide Convention. And that was written by Civil Rights Congress, presented to the UN at a Paris meeting in 1951. I would say that this current petition, which started in Britain, does add the element of ecocide, which again tries to frame the element of reparations within the context of planetary repairs. Okay, I think that's more or less what I wanted to share with you. There are other aspects, such as international links and movements that are fighting against ecocide and the pillaging that continues on the continent of Africa and elsewhere. These things did not go away. In fact, you can sometimes trace some of the companies listed on the London Stock Exchange, for example. Some of them will have roots going a couple of hundred years back, roots to this painful history, and they still continue to exploit, and they still continue to wreak havoc on our planet with devastating consequences that I'm sure we're all aware of, and most of us will be aware as well, that it will be places in the global south that will suffer perhaps harder through climate change. Yet again, by and large, these communities are not responsible for climate change. It is us and our consumerism and our greed and the ever want for more that causes some of these effects. So I do hope that as Green Party members here in the UK, we can do what we can at home, but we can also understand all of our privilege. And no matter the struggles I've been through in my life, I also understand my own privilege. And one thing that drives me is the idea that I can encourage and be a voice for and work alongside people in other countries who do not always even have the privilege of freedom of speech. I think I would close what I want to say by saying that due to my decolonisation work in Bristol with the campaign group Countering Colston, I was invited to Trinidad in 2017. And that was a great experience. In fact, one of the things that they were doing, and they called themselves Roads Must Fall Caribbean, influenced by the Roads Must Fall movement, was that they wanted to recontextualize certain texts. For example, they had a plantation in Trinidad that described the plantation's owners as illustrious and the enslaved as loyal slaves. That got changed. The University of the West Indies residential campus was named after Milner, who was kind of the right-hand man to Cecil Rhodes. That got changed. And they also wanted to take down the statue of Christopher Columbus. And for many indigenous people, Christopher Columbus and his interruption on his explorations, in inverted commas, was the First World War. The First World War that hasn't ended, but a First World War that we must come together to end. And I think I'll leave it there so that we have enough time for discussion. I can see quite a lot going on in the chat. I'm not sure if I'll catch all of it, but I'm sure someone will summarize. Thank you.
Thank you, Cleo. That was fantastic. Such a good kind of overview, and but also some real depth there to the issues. And I really like the way you brought some of your own personal life, personal history into that. Yes, we've got a number of questions. I've grouped a few of them together. I think a good place to start is around diversity in politics, both in our Green Party and in other parties. So I've got two questions, one from Helen Ross and one from Ruth. And I'll just ask each of them to unmute themselves and ask you their question directly. So Helen Ross, if you want to go first, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. It was amazing. My question is, our current cabinet of 21 people has only 5 women, only 2 people of colour, neither of whom are Black. Do you think the focus on American racism rather than British racism has allowed our politicians a place to hide their racism, sexism, and misogynoir?
Thank you, Helen. And just get Ruth to ask her question, which is a bit more focused on our Green Party. Go ahead, Ruth.
Yeah, sure. So I'm just wondering what more ambitious targets you think the Green Party should be doing in relation to diversity internally, so partly to model a more diverse movement in general, as well as kind of acting the way we should, and kind of what the benefits of that would be. So how can we up our game, and what should that look like?
Thank you both. Cool. Over to you,
Okay,
Cleo.
thank you, Helen and Ruth. Yeah, I think there is that aspect of deflecting and keeping, a focus on America, which perhaps does seem a little more overt in its racism. But we did see that actually a lack of acknowledgement that some people are in complete denial that we've got any issues within our criminal justice system, which is absolutely bizarre because it is rife with institutional racism. One example of that would be our parole boards within the criminal justice system, possibly a less, highlighted one in the media, but these parole boards are not diverse, and someone, will be questioned and will have to relive whatever the mistake it was they made, etc., etc. There's a lot of intimidation, and people are disproportionately kept in jail if they are of African heritage. I think as well, it does speak to institutional racism, and a word again that has developed over the last few years is this aspect of Afrophobia. And I don't know what some of you would make of that. Of course, we've heard terms like Islamophobia, but do we have to acknowledge that beyond racism, there is also in this country aspects of Afrophobia? And that can be, from the stereotypical someone feeling a little threatened if there is a young Black man walking by them. We've all heard stories about that. And just an overreaction and, a patronizing view at times, and a complete underestimation of the potential of people of African heritage. And we see that in the education system. So yeah, I don't think it's particularly encouraging. Of course, the government has, formed this racial disparity commission. But again, the success of that will depend on who's around the table and who they're actually talking to and who's leading it. In terms of diversity internally within the Green Party, a simple answer to that would be, as well as elected people into office, leadership and on the various boards, let's have a look at the employment statistics. Let's be sure that there's fairness in employment and that people aren't just employing people who look like themselves. And I think a way to actively support communities, and that's not, it's not saying you shouldn't be the best person for the job and all of that, but sometimes it does come down to who's also financially supporting. So I would say getting more people employed within the Green Party from diverse backgrounds would be a very good place to start.
Great, thank you. Going to move us on to interesting question from Caroline. And this is, maybe looking at other social justice movements like feminism back in the 70s and 80s and drawing some parallels there and some intersectionality with the things we're going through today, including Black Lives Matter and the environment. So Caroline, if you could unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question, please.
Hi, Cleo. Thanks for coming this evening. So my question, bear with me. So to me, the failure of the Green movement to involve all ethnicities equally is similar to the feminist movement of the 70s and 80s, where there was a complete failure to recognise white privilege and intersectionality. And I just wondered if there is a similar thing going on with the environmental movement in this country today, and how do we start to recognise our part in this and how to bring change?
Great, thanks for that question. I think it is similar to how you describe the feminist movement, and there's been many criticisms of that movement by women of colour. And I think it is echoed in the climate movement. And I think something that we often talk a good game at the Green Party, but sometimes we need to go a little further than that. When I did stand as deputy leader, it was very much about putting environmental justice and economic justice and social justice and racial justice in the same pot, and understanding the links between them, but also understanding that, and I've come to understand more actually, that, we have to look at the political landscape in this country. And if we're serious about making significant changes, or for some of us, serious about getting more elected MPs and all the rest of it, and actually being a political force, then we have to do better at bringing working class people with us, because they are a huge majority in this country. So without them and their vote and their confidence and support, where will we be? I think a lot of our policies would benefit them, but unfortunately, so far, we haven't been able to cross certain boundaries and get our message out to these people. Again, though, in terms of representation and intersectionality and diversity in the climate movement, there are people there. Let's also reflect that many of the environmental disasters have been global, and there have been people for generations, decades, centuries fighting this every single step of the way. However, sometimes people's arrogance does not recognize these movements or these struggles. There was a great project, I think it came out, or a resource I should say, last year, and it was called Climate Reframe. And it was a catalogue of all the people of colour based in the UK who are working within the climate movement, or activists, etc. And it was extensive. There are so many people out there doing things, but maybe it's because they aren't getting the media attention or the social media following, etc., etc. But these people do exist. I think, if we think of ecocide and genocide, I'm led back to thinking of America. And of course, people would have resisted it from day one. And I think it's really important that we can keep our activism going and also recognise the efforts, whatever people think of movements like Cllr. But within all of this, it would seem natural to me to seek counsel from First Nations people, and to understand that perhaps for us to go forward, we have to in some ways go back. and be humble enough to keep flying the flag, but also talk to people who will have knowledge about the earth and about nature, many things perhaps that we've lost, and to seek counsel from them and guidance.
I'm going to ask Amanda to ask her questions, quite a sort of short question, but quite, quite strong and very relevant. So Amanda, go for it, please.
Cleo, thank you very much. A great talk. I was wondering if you thought that the biggest way in which we were not acknowledging that Black Lives Matter is by failing to tackle climate change, as it's people in the white West who way by and large are causing it, but this is already causing people to die in places like Africa, something which just doesn't seem to be mentioned very little at all in the press.
I think it's a very good point that you make, and I think sadly that possibly is the truth, because it's this kind of, exploitative, extractive culture, a toxic culture that's been allowed to permeate and exist for centuries, really. Of course, there have been some challenges, but now with the climate change movement, I guess this is a bigger challenge on this kind of practice. But yeah, it seems that Black lives don't matter because they're at the brunt of a lot of this action. So I would agree with you with that, but let's try to be hopeful. And also we have to look at power dynamics. Britain still does have quite a lot of power, which doesn't work in favour of the marginalised. There was something else I wanted to say, but it slips my mind. But if it comes back, I will say that. But yeah, I think that's a very good point that you make, that it hasn't mattered as much because it hasn't affected people like it affects people abroad. And sometimes it's too late when it comes to your door, when we start to get flooding and all the rest of it here. I think it also makes me think of the phrase, the Black Mediterranean. And again, I really feel that, future generations will look back on this period and view it in many ways as badly as I hope all of us view the transatlantic trafficking and enslavement of African people. Because the thought of, people fleeing from dangerous situations, often caused by climate change actually, and caused by the West, are just left to die in the Mediterranean. There'll be people now desperately trying to seek sanctuary and safety, and they've just been left to die. Their lives mean nothing. It was the artist, the British Ghanaian artist John Okomfora, who made the point, kind of running alongside his exhibition Vertigo Sea. Okay, Vertigo Sea, which tried to bring together the period of transatlantic trafficking enslaved Africans, also a bit of climate and the migrant crisis. And he said, when and how was it that somebody migrated from being a human being to a cockroach? And that was coming from some of the things that were put in our press about people seeking safety and migrants. They were described in our country in the last couple of years as cockroaches. Yet, let's not fool ourselves that without immigration, our country would struggle economically and all the rest of it. So let's try to do what we can to do away with this toxic, damaging, destructive narrative that has just been allowed to roll on, often at the hands of privilege.
And just picking up on the migrant kind of crisis and policies to support migrants, I've got Matt Maddock here, who's just got a question about the migrant policy in the Green Party. Go ahead, Matt.
Hi, thanks for your talk tonight. It's been very, very interesting. So my question is, the government is apparently planning for like a +4 degree world. And that's a world where some experts sort of suggest roughly 2 billion people are going to be displaced globally. And that's mostly going to be people from the global south when India and huge areas of Africa are basically uninhabitable. So with the current sort of level of anti-immigrant rhetoric and activism from the far right, a lot of which was played into by the government, what role do you think the Green Party needs to take to protect migrants and refugees?
Thank you for that question. I think we just need to continue to do what we are doing, which is speaking out and speaking up and standing with the marginalised in our communities, and being the party really who still cares and is about humanity and the planet and people over profit or over what perhaps is popular. It won't always be easy. You know, it is difficult, and there is, as you say, the perception of the rise of the right and all of these things against us. But I just think we need to stand firm, and we need to have leadership that is not afraid to challenge these things, because come on, there are a good number of people out there, and I would hope that the majority of people are good people who do care and are for humanity. But as we've seen the divisions that have occurred from Brexit, we are kind of on a crossroads really in this country, and it's all up to us individually to decide which way we want this to go. And of course we do need to keep lobbying for things like proportional representation, because we desperately need fairness within the electoral system, so that we do have more of a chance to bring some of these policies off the paper and into practice. What would be your thoughts, Matt? I'd be interested.
I mean, my concern is that there are some in the party who argue that letting people come here means that they consume more, and there seems to be a contingent in the party that are more interested in talking about quote unquote population issues, which I don't think is a big deal, because actually it's about overconsumption. I guess it's part of what I'm worried about is the people within our own party who talk in those ways, and then as we're seeing in sort of other European countries, the sort of rise of far right eco-fascists who try to co-opt environmental movements into another far right movement, which again, some of those that language can sort of help develop, which is scary to me. I mean, the fact that we currently are letting so many people die in the Mediterranean is terrifying, and the idea that when the migrant crisis is going to be magnitudes worse, that we would suddenly find our better angels. I don't see that happening.
Yeah, you're raising important points there, and I think there is policies as well that are about trying to improve things abroad in these other places. So I guess in some ways that could tie into the international movement for reparations. Let's try to repair some of the damage in these places where people are fleeing from. Of course, if it's environmental disasters, that's going to be more of a challenge. But there are so many places in the world that have been left in a really bad situation, and haven't really got on their feet since independence, which would have occurred in the 50s and 60s. And some also are still paying debts to the West. When we think about reparations, we could also think, and this history, we could also think about places like Haiti, who pay an enormous amount of money to France. I mean, we know Haiti for having natural disasters and all the rest of it, and severe poverty, but it was also the first Black Republic or African Heritage Republic in the free world, and they've paid the price ever since. It wasn't a freedom, it was a freedom they fought for and rebelled for, but it was also a freedom that they still pay for. The idea of Haiti paying France billions is beyond belief. And I think, yeah, there are some dangerous theories about population control. And as you mentioned yourself, Matt, that let's be real. the thought of, you know, forced sterilization in Africa, if you like, which is a threat that seems to come back time and time again. The amount of consumption that happens there is nowhere near. Perhaps a whole country is less than what it is in a few cities, even in our country. So I guess framing this with some facts and reality to dispel some of the fear-mongering myths is also really important.
I'm going to take us to Matt Fisher, who's got an interesting question about intergenerational challenges. So go ahead, Matt, please.
Thanks. Hi there, Cleo. Thanks very much for this evening. What approach or indeed tactic should we adopt to tackle the varied beliefs across the generations? So that is spanning education, the social norms, experiences, the language, all of that that's used, ranging from, let's say, infant school through to the baby boomers. It's quite a challenge, isn't it?
It is a big challenge. It's a big challenge. And, you know, when I do things, say things, more recently, I've been thinking about unintended consequences. Doesn't mean I want to tone down what I say, but I am committed to trying my best to bring people with me in what I think. And my attitude also is, and it was when I was Lord Mayor of Bristol, when I removed a portrait from the Lord Mayor's parlour of enslaver Edward Colston. You know, there were some people who were overjoyed and some people who were very angry. And Bristol in some ways is quite split in that way. And a lot of it does come down to the lack of a holistic education. But my point there would be that someone with an opposing view to me, even someone who we might all say was obviously racist, I would, if I could, and if the situation was there, I would talk to that person and have a conversation. We had in Bristol something called the City Conversations that toured around the city, spoke about Bristol's enslaving past and privilege and all these type of things, education inequality, poverty and things like that. And there was an interesting older man there, and I went and spoke to him at the end and I said, "Good evening, I am your Lord Mayor of Bristol." And he was furious at me for removing the portrait. And he was saying this and saying that, and there was lots of people around him telling him to shut up. But I actually said to these people, look, just stand down a minute, let me talk to this person. And I spoke to him, he went from very angry to mutual respect in about 15, 20 minutes. We had things in common. I heard him, he heard me. There's little chance of taking things forward if we shout at each other. And if we, whilst it's very difficult to listen to people who have offensive views, sometimes it's important to have a dialogue, because people won't shift if they're not informed or if they don't have the opportunity to think outside of the box they've been put in. So I think education is important, languages is important, and mixing and integrating, having different experiences is really important. I was, and still am actually, a creative dance exercise leader for people who were over 60. And we had a dance group of people over 60, most of them were in their 70s, called the Caribbean Cruisers a few years back, all of Caribbean heritage elders. And we would visit care homes. And it was quite clear, visiting areas that weren't diverse, that this may have been one of the first times that some people actually mixed and integrated. And it was quite an eye-opener to see people later in life realizing, well, look, we're having a laugh, we're having a joke, we've got things in common, we're all human beings, let's just get on, you know? So I think trying not to make it too complicated, trying not to preach to people, trying to empathize a little with other people's journey. And again, as a politician, of course, I've advocated for African heritage issues, also about equality for more than that, and class issues. And one of the things I've advocated for is that actually underprivileged classes should be recognised in the Equalities Act. you know, because at the moment there's certain protections in theory and on paper for, say, your gender, your sex, your race, this, that, and the other, but class is not one of them. And I think that's an issue. And I think it should be expressly mentioned in any policy that any local authority or government puts through.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Right.
One little minute.
One little minute.
I'd like to just Simon to quickly ask a question, and you can be as brief as you want with this, Cleo, but I think it's just a nice question to sort of end on. So go ahead, Simon.
Thanks, Stefan. Hi, Cleo. I'm the Snowdon's Green Councillor here, so it's great to meet you, and thank you so much for giving up your time this evening. I spend every day thinking about environment issues, but I'm really keen to learn more about the other issues you've talked about. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about why kind of talking about your African heritage is so important to you.
It's important to me because it's something that I've almost had to fight for, actually. And when we think about reparations, it is that most of us do not have our own names. Okay, so most of our names that we have would actually be the name of the enslaver. There are more Campbells in Jamaica than there are in Scotland, for example. That isn't necessarily that all of those people were enslavers, but it says something. And I say that as a woman who on my mother's side is Scots-Canadian and a Campbell. It's important to me because it's just been a journey I've been on since I was very, very small. My mother, who is, if you like, in inverted commas, white British, would educate me as much as she could. And she would take me on demonstrations from the age of about 6, to be honest, you know, anti-fascist demonstrations and things like Stop the Asylum Bill. So I'm thankful for the education that I had. I'm also thankful for the little that my father showed me and gave me before he passed when I was 10. And I think it's just a drive within me, again, from receiving that book of Black Americana, seeing that there's been a massive injustice that's been done in the world and in history and in the present. And it's something that desperately needs to be remedied. And I really see it as something that is very painful. Perhaps some of us can't recognize that, but there is a deep pain on all sides, regardless of what race you are. You know, there was a constellation therapy workshop in Bristol a couple of years ago on the topic of colonialism, mainly attended by fairly wealthy European people, actually, who were just torn apart by things that had occurred in their family history and of how things were playing out still today. And it was quite clear that actually it's not just African heritage people who need to heal from this. It's not just people who've been colonized and have the pain of discrimination and the inherited trauma from that, but it's all of us. All of us need to come together. All of us need to heal. All of us need to move forward. But I'm incredibly proud to be dual heritage, and I'm incredibly proud of my African heritage. I can't get close to that through language. I have visited Ghana. I'd say that's my adopted second home. I find my Africanness within my creativity and through things like dance, because I am different. I am of African heritage, but there's so much that's been lost, you know, so it's about that aspect of trying to regain that. And again, being aware, growing up, I feel that things are better now, but there was a time when it was unpopular to be African. Even some of my elders from the Caribbean, you talk about heritage and history, they'll tell you they're everything else. And the last thing they'll tell you is that they're African. I've seen that shifting now, where people can be proud of who they are and understand the amazing civilization that occurs on the continent, not the lies and the tales and the rubbish that has been presented to us. I know we're running out of time and I need to rush along in a minute, but I did think I would love to end, and it seems relevant to tie it in, on a few quotes from Audre Lorde, from her piece, "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House." This hatred and our anger are very different. Hatred is the fury of those who do not share our goals, and its object is death and destruction. Anger is a grief of distortions between peers, and its object is change. I cannot hide my anger to spare your guilt, nor hurt feelings, nor answering anger, for to do so insults and trivializes all our efforts. Guilt is not a response to anger, it is a response to one's own actions or lack of actions. Yet all too often, guilt is just another name for impotence, for defensiveness, destruction of communication. It becomes a device to protect ignorance and the continuation of things the way they are, the ultimate protection for changelessness. Decisions to cut aid for the terminally ill, for the elderly, for dependent children, for food stamps, even school lunches are being made by men with full stomachs who live in comfortable houses with 2 cars and umpteen tax shelters. You do not have to be me in order for us to fight alongside each other. Thank you for listening. It's been great spending an hour with you.
Thank you, Cleo, so much. And on behalf of all of us, thanks for taking that hour out with us. And I think we'll all take a lot from it. And, we will really save this recording and listen to it again and share it more widely as well. So I really appreciate that. And yeah, take care. Get your son to drumming lessons. Hope he has a good thrash. And yeah, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much.